And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining us for our marine section for today. So I'll take a quick look at the ice edge. We still do have some ice all along the Arctic coastline out to just north of Wayne right there. The big story is as we move into Friday, we do expect northerly winds to pick up, which is going to start pushing all of the ice farther to the south, including this ice here that is west of Kivalina. Moving into a quick recap focused on the marine areas for Friday. Out over the Bering Sea, we have some weak ridging here following behind a front that we had pushing through the state. And behind that ridging, we have a system moving into the Aleutian Islands. It's going to bring a little bit of stronger winds out of a westerly direction here. As we move out over the Gulf waters, westerly flow behind a different front that we have pushing through the Gulf waters, and then some weak ridging here hanging out over the Panhandle area on Friday. As we move into Saturday, a broad weakening of the flow, primarily westerly in nature. And then as we look out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, another system pushing through the area, continued somewhat westerly winds to a lot of the areas behind that system. So starting off down in the Panhandle area on Friday, we have some weaker winds in many of the inside water areas, primarily out of the south, getting up to as high as 15 knots in Lynn Canal. And then out over the Gulf waters, pretty weak here, 10 knots in most locations until you get north and west of Yakutat, where we'll start to see some stronger winds out of the east around 25 knots. Moving into Saturday in the inside water, southeast winds 10 to 15 knots for the most part, getting up a little bit stronger there in Lynn Canal, 25 knots expected. West winds throughout the Gulf waters, 15 to 20 knots. As we look out over south central, we're going to have primarily easterly winds up along the coastline, even though we do have westerly winds farther out in the Gulf. We have a little bit of a barrier jet here, bringing in some easterly winds 20 to 25 knots. And that's going to be in Prince William Sound as well. Out in the Cook Inlet area, southerly winds 25 knots expected. And then out by the Barren Islands, westerly flow around 15 knots. Moving into Saturday, quite a bit weaker winds in the northern portions of the Gulf, but as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, we're going to see a westerly component to the winds up to 15 knots and then 20 knots on the western side. Up in Cook Inlet area, southwest winds 10 to 15 knots, highest as we get farther to the south. For Friday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting by Kodiak Island, we have southwesterly winds, 20 knots expected there. And then around the peninsula, southwest winds 15 knots, dropping down to be variable 10 as we get closer towards the Cold Bay area. Then on Saturday, still fairly weak, primarily variable winds around 10 knots, but out by the western portions of the Alaska Peninsula, we are seeing some winds of a south to southwest direction around 15 knots. And by Kodiak Island, also south to southwest, 15 knots there. Friday for the Aleutian Islands, as we start off to the east, variable winds there around 10 knots, increasing to 15 and eventually 20 knots, becoming southerly as we get by the central Aleutian Islands. And then by the western Aleutian Islands, east to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Moving into Saturday, that's going to switch up quite a bit here, becoming more westerly, 15 to 20 knots, up to as high as 25 knots as we get closer towards Adak. And then for the rest of the central Aleutian Islands, southwest 25, dropping down to more 20 to 25 as you get by the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast, primarily westerly flow, 15 knots north of Nunavik Island, 15 to 20 knots south of the island. And then for out over the Bering Sea, westerly winds around 15 knots expected. Moving into Saturday, weaker up by St. Matthew Island there, 10 knots variable wind direction. South winds 20 knots by the Pribilof Islands. And then weaker flow out of a south to southwest direction, 10 knots for most of the southwest coastline, but in Norton Sound a little bit stronger, westerly winds 20 knots expected. Along the Arctic coast, we are seeing some stronger northeasterly winds, 15 to 25 knots, getting stronger as we get closer towards the northwest portions of the coast by Cape Lisburne up to as high as 30 knots. Switching up quite a bit by the Bering Strait area, a westerly component and somewhat southerly as we get a little bit to the north, around 15 knots there. Then on Saturday, all north winds, 15 to 20 knots along the west coast and around 20 knots along the Arctic coastline. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.